course lead for popular music performance at Leeds Arts University. This presentation concerns a forthcoming book, Stories We Could Tell, to be published by Routledge, authored by the late Professor David Sanchez of Salford University, and edited by myself, my two esteemed colleagues, Dr. Mark Duffett and Ben Halligan. Dr. Ben Halligan. So the book asks the following questions. How has the history of rock and roll been told? Has it become formulaic, or has it remained, like the music itself, open to outside influences? Who have been the genre's primary historians, and what common frameworks or sets of assumptions have music history narratives shared? Stories We Could Tell identifies 8 typical strategies used when critics and historians write about American popular music. So, Stories We Can Tell, invites readers to deepen their engagement with popular music by considering the mediating role of critics and writers in the creation of music history. The book proposes that the most persistent formats that writers of rock and roll histories embrace are the instinctual, the Darwinian, the heroic, the ritual, the alluvial, the agoraphobic, the Manichaean, and the mythic. Stories We Could Tell critically discusses each one of these ways of presenting the history of popular music genres. The book is a unique work of music historiography that analyses, catalogues and contextualises music writing in order to afford the reader new perspective on the fields of cultural production. The book has 3 specific aims. First, by focusing on rock and roll, it creates an inventory of the 8 most persistent narrative patterns used by popular music historians. Each of these narrative patterns has been employed to produce books of immeasurable value, and our knowledge of the subject would undeniably be deficient without them. The book does not dismiss the 8 patterns or make potential inferiorities the main focus of discussion. Instead, it recognises their abundant usefulness as tools of investigation. The book's second aim is to elucidate assumptions that have governed the development of each pattern. And finally, the book considers each strategy's theoretical and ideological consequences. Thank you, David. By the time of his passing in 2011, David Sanchez was an academic of global standing who had served both as president of IASPM US and as an advisor to many organisations, including the Library of Congress, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, NARAS, and the Blues Foundation. Stories We Could Tell emerged from Dave's unique journey. During his corporate professional life, he had been in occasional proximity to some of the instigators of post-war popular music culture, figures as diverse as Alan Lomax, John Lee Hooker, and Chuck D. His experience as a participant in the US music industry in turn appealed to the University of Salford, but for David, exploring ideas in a scholarly context was an equally important part of his vocation. That and spending as much time as he could with first and second years, which was very unusual for a professor of that standing. He moved across commercial and academic sectors and sought to bridge the two, and so found himself concerned with the prerogatives and tendencies of each. In each case outlined here, the concepts are discussed in greater depth in the chapters of the book, clearly. And so in this context and company, I'm only able to provide the briefest summary of each idea, each of which in itself might be a topic for a paper or a seminar. So, throughout Stories We Could Tell, Sanchez notes that methodological differences in academic writing about popular music suggest a tension that is in need of resolution, and one that ultimately can be taken as a dialogue over the question of the ownership of cultural history. This can be understood as a question of definitions, but also in the terms of stories or narratives. In the opening chapter, Sanchez identifies a vivid visual metaphor for the formation of historical narratives, as well as noting the often arbitrary manner with which chronology can be rounded out into convenient chunks of time. A further consideration of narratives of American popular music can now occur. What are the coordinates of examples of an exclusionary approach that can be uncovered and are often passed off as the official histories of popular music? The second chapter therefore identifies bodies of received wisdom as an operation across academic and journalistic writing about popular music, indeed sometimes emanating from the same authors. This is understood as necessarily limiting in canonical terms, but also offering a buttressing of items of faith in terms of the perceived truthfulness or exactitude regarding received stories about American popular music, particularly in the post-war period. At this juncture, Sanchez outlines and introduces the 8 tendencies that he has identified as shaping and structuring such narratives of received wisdom. I've got to be careful because when I get excited I start babbling. Are we all still together?
I'm with you.
Perfect. Good. Right, and so we're into the narratives. Instinctual. The first of these is the instinctual narrative. For Sanchez, The sheen of sophistication amounts to a limitation and distraction in popular music, and the impulse to overturn conventional categories of taste and tact governs the methodology at work in the instinctual narrative of popular music history. All of its proponents advocate the upending of the propositions of the intellect and the unwrapping of all the impulses that take over when heart is unbridled from head in the creative impulse inherent in popular music. Formal complexity and demonstrable originality take a back seat to recycling and rearticulation, as the novelty of a particular riff or rhythm matters less than the ultimate audience acceptance of the material. In offering Little Richard, Elvis Presley, Lester Bangs, Nick Cone and George Melly, amongst its examples, the chapter explains how the instinctual narrative disdains all pretensions to sophistication and elevates whatever the critical establishment condemns as trash. A really good working example of that would be the Sex Pistols refusing to attend their own induction at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We're not coming, $25,000 to sit at the feet of the great. We're not coming. Perfect. Thank you. In the context of popular music, announcements of the death of rock, or the collapse of the record business, or the exhaustion of a star's career, or the disappearance of a recording format, not only appeals to the journalistic imperative for marketable value judgments, but also the necrological inclination of part of the current public imagination. Adopting an evolutionary framework permits the author of many popular music histories to draw upon a convenient and far from inappropriate mechanism to select from a potentially overwhelming body of evidence certain representative examples that can help to engineer a coherent and illuminating plot. This is going out towards rhizomatic theory, because it's possible to impose a coherent plot on something which is actually quite messy. This narrative embodies the notion that, like a species, a cultural phenomenon arises, develops, and potentially decays throughout the course of its existence. The chapter notes that complications occur when authors transpose the delineation of interactions between human agents into a kind of moral allegory, indicating that something dubious occurs when contractual agreements take on the complexion of a bargaining of souls. The chapter explains that the propensity to succumb to single-mindedness attended in such a monomaniacal perspective is evident at times in the works of Donald Clark, Martha Bales, Margaret Judge, James Miller and Chuck Eddy. Additionally, Donald Clark's text, The Rise and Fall of Popular Music, epitomises the Darwinian narrative in its most undiluted fashion and is explored within this section of the book. The heroic narrative explores the notion that our society venerates the cult of celebrity so vigorously that to choose anonymity over adulation in the minds of many people comes close to the behaviour of a lunatic. This chapter notes that the persistence with which cultural heroism has been venerated, let alone how the parameters of the phenomenon have changed very little since the ascendance of Romanticism in the 19th century, is quite remarkable. That's definitely one of David's embedded sentences, I think, embedded dependent clauses. To put the matter in cinematic terms, proponents of this approach conduct their narratives as if they occur almost entirely in close-up and abandon the critical perspective that can be found in the long shot. In that manner, the subjects of those narratives become the centre of a very narrow universe in which the other characters circulate as little more than satellites. The chapter notes that all creative processes require joint effort, and that the solipsistic thrust of the heroic narrative blinds itself to this simple fact. To discuss the domain of popular music and ignore the effects of producers, arrangers, recording engineers, publishers, backup singers, session musicians, or song pluggers is to reinforce a kind of antiquated romantic rhetoric. The ritual narrative illustrates the mythology of a social group, with a conception in sound of how adherents to this idea believe the world operates, or alternately, how they wish it would. Even when one becomes party to a set of rituals, that does not necessarily constitute entry into the understanding of the community from which they arise. My subject area is blues, and I think this particular narrative applies incredibly strongly here. And yet the effort must continue to be made to widen one's repertoire and enter into unknown spheres with unfamiliar, perhaps even unfathomable practices. Otherwise, we remain myopic and single-minded, cut off and alien to any sphere other than the one into which we were born. We must remain open-minded. Rituals can serve as one of the most potent markers with which that process of social osmosis can proceed. and music often acts as a particularly effective passport between disparate territories. Citing in some detail the work of Christopher Small, Albert Murray and Ken Burns, the chapter refers to Mike Bloomfield and Wynton Marsalis in its exploration of inculturation and acculturation in popular music narratives. And it's particularly interesting to see Mike Bloomfield, who was so embraced by the blues and folk community, had issues engaging with some of the rituals that are inherent to that community, but that's a story for another day. The alluvial narrative, which concerns Chapter 7, reflects the laudable, though sometimes limited, assertion that the complex formal threads of American popular music bear analogies to the equally diverse texture of their national social fabric. In effect, this perspective could be thought of as the argument contained in the proposition of multiculturalism, but wrought in the musical key. The alluvial narrative proposes that the nation's copious genres and subspecies of performance constitutes a body of individual rivulets or streams that follow a kind of common imperative to coalesce into a single body of water that eventually expels itself into a global cultural sea. The chapter explores this notion using examples drawn from contrasting styles and genres of American popular music selected from across the 20th century. As you can see, we're nearly there. The agoraphobic narrative. There are two approaches endemic to the agoraphobic narrative, which concerns Chapter 8. First, writers partake of a time-worn and ultimately hollow dichotomy between art and commerce, such that never the twain can meet, to paraphrase Rudyard Kipling. Second, the writers of agoraphobic narratives treat the music industry as a monolith, its various elements acting so much in unison as if they possessed a single consciousness. I think you began to talk a little bit about this. This kind of perspective not only appeals to the conspiratorial imperative, but also tends to transform musicians who sign record deals into unconscious dupes bereft of business acumen or autonomy. The agoraphobic narrative consequently routinely assigns venal motives to any commercial activity undertaken by cultural workers in the pursuit of disseminating popular music. The chapter illustrates this narrative through the work of Scott DeVoe, Steve Chappell, and Really Garofalo, amongst others. The Manichaean narrative borrows a theological notion, the endless fight between good and evil in the world, to address the popular tendency to moralise episodes in music history as a battle for supremacy between opposing elements such as pop and rock, or theatricality or authenticity, maybe as we talked about between analogue and digital. Here, Sanchez explores the notion of encountering a crossroads implicit in, say, the waning of 50s rock and roll, the selling out associated with folk in the 1960s, or the death of rock in the 1990s. Similarly, the death of the blues, which apparently has been dying for the last 60 years. The chapter argues the historical discussion is less productive when the nuances of music culture are lost to polarising oversimplification. An either-or approach is overwhelmingly reductive, operating at the expense of attention to valuable detail. But it sells well. Finally, Chapter 10 in the book posits that myth can be understood to mean a commonly held and collectively sanctioned belief or constellation of assumptions. The mythic narrative, therefore, tends to be a category in the telling of popular music history associated with a wide range of stories. Collectively, they rest on a process that exploits the usable past by framing music culture in relation to either personal transformation, musical tradition, or national identity. To examine these different ways to resonate with existing audience expectations, the chapter analyses accounts of music history from the autobiography of the Kinks frontman Ray Davies to Greil Marcus's Mystery Train, and illuminates the complexities of each form. It's a source of some frustration to me that the manuscript was completed before the release of the B.B. King biopic and the Eric Clapton biopic, because that to me seems like some of these narratives in real action, the telling of a story before you pass from the world in order to perhaps secure your own legacy. The book's conclusion examines in greater depth the issue of how a cultural historian comes to retain or repel a requisite degree of expertise. Three foundational concerns are introduced in response to this issue. Firstly, the fact that the material record of American popular music has swollen exponentially, as well as increasingly being placed out of reach through either the legal system or virtual abandonment by its mechanical copyright holders. Secondly, that a pervasive fascination with scenes on the part of cultural historians, as well as the facile manner with which those environments are more often than not depicted, is a limiting tendency. And thirdly, the propensity, however inoculated by those chroniclers and many consumers, to decline to venture beyond their immediate comfort zones. One of the One of the hallmarks of the book is David's treatment of culture as almost like a buffet. Yes, he's rooted in music, but he draws very strongly on film and TV in order to make the point of music in context. Following a discussion of these points, the conclusion outlines an alternative approach towards evidence and its appraisal. Professor is the highest teaching rank that we as a society can offer. These best teachers are like lighthouses. They stand on the boundaries of all that we know, using the brilliance of their intellect to illuminate our cultural surroundings, that we might navigate these shifting waters, mindful of the dangers of the rocks beneath, and pointing the way to new horizons. With this in mind, Stories We Could Tell is not a prescriptive taxonomy, but more a map designed to guide the reader in their exploration and understanding of the currents and tides that form the corpus, and most importantly, the context of popular music. Thank you. Good.
Tom, thank you very much, Tom, and I think congratulations to Tom and to Mark and co-editor Benjamin Hannigan, who isn't here today. For I think a very honourable and worthwhile project that you've put together. Congratulations. Come on to questions briefly in just a second, Paddy, and I've just found out that we have a fourth speaker, Matty. I don't know what everybody else. I'd only got 3 speakers down my list.
You're not on the guest list. You're not.
Anyway,
I'm just
Matty's here. We're pretty much on good time. So yes, we have Matty to come in a minute or a couple of minutes. So questions for Tom, please.
I've got one. I'm going to make myself look really stupid here because I should know the answer to this. Within the corpus and canon of rock journalism, the notion of gonzo journalism is very prevalent. This is the bit where I'm going to look really stupid. Which one does that sit in? I'm guessing yeah.
I would say...
You're the expert.
Well, I'm one of David's students, is one of the things. Yeah. I'd say, to me, gonzo journalism would seem to be instinctual.
Yeah, that's what I was guessing,
Yeah, because what we're thinking about is not necessarily, as David describes it, like, he's not, rather than thinking about polish and say, for instance, or someone like Frank Sinatra, moving into journalism, it's more about what does it feel like now? How does it feel to like? How do you make it smelly? How do you make it organic? One of the examples he talks about Nick Cohn a great deal.
Nick Cohn and the dark stuff. Yeah, that would be a classic piece of content. Yeah, I mean that's
So I think you're right. I mean, one of the things with such taxonomy is it's possible to find examples of writing and setting examples that straddle 2 or 3 of these. And I think part of the joy of the book is to give people a tool to begin to say, well, actually, I can see how it's instinctual, but I can also see how that's kind of heroic at the same time. So, for instance, the story of someone like Little Richard could be in equal parts heroic and equal parts instinctual, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wicked question, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask a question you just answered.
Okay.
Just talking about people who find narratives, there must be some overlap. There must be a lot of examples of people who write examples.
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely. One of the things, as cultural specialists, what we'll know is that life is messy, and the most that we can do is to hope for a way of plotting a path through not conflicting but converging influences, and in order to try and make sense of them. The title of the book is about stories, and surely the function of stories is to make sense of reality. The title goes on to be called Stories We Could Tell. So rather than being monolithic about it, is to say, well, okay, here's an approach which can work for the way we look at this particular type of writing. It seems to be quite fruitful.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.